to our Irish Institute for Catholic Studies lecture. And today our presenter is Carleigh Garcia. And Carleigh is an American international PhD student in English language and literature at Mary Immaculate College, Limerick. And she works as a departmental assistant to the English department, as well as research assistant to the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies. And her work is amazing, and we couldn't survive without her. Carleigh received a first-class honours Bachelor of Arts from Benedictine College, Atchison, Kansas, in 2018, where she studied English and business with a concentration in pre-law. She received an award, a very prestigious one, the Government of Ireland International Education Scholarship, and she moved to Limerick to begin her Masters in Arts by Research in January 2019. She's since upgraded her degree to a PhD, and her thesis focuses on affect theory, shame, and the Catholic Church in Irish literature, written since 1940. And today she will be focusing on shame and Irish Catholicism in Edna O'Brien's The Country Girls Trilogy and Epilogue. So thank you so much, Carleigh, for being with us today and for presenting. So we hand over to you.
Hi, thank you, Trish. It's great that you all came today. So I'll begin. So my PhD, like Trish said, involves analyzing 7 Irish novels written between 1940 and 2010 through the lens of affect theory, focusing on the affect of shame and the influence of the Catholic Church, to understand and evaluate this link between the Church and shame in Irish literature following the independence of the Irish Free State in 1922. Shame is both social and biological, leading to the importance of looking at cultural sources when discussing shame. Today I will use The Country Girls Trilogy and Epilogue by Edna O'Brien to establish and explore this relationship between shame and culture, specifically in relation to sexuality, gender, familial relations, education, marriage, and the Church through O'Brien's characters in their everyday lives. Affect theory was founded by Sylvan Tompkins in the 1960s. He defines shame as an innate precognitive negative affect, which occurs after the positive affects of joy or interest have been partially depleted. Crucially, what this means is that the only source of shame you can have is from something you are interested in. If you feel joy or interest from something, and then for whatever reason that joy or interest is partially diminished, you will feel shame. Shame marks us as human, we all blush, but the object, the source of our shame will vary, as will the intensity, varying from a slight blush to humiliation, mortification, and suicide. Probin tells us that whatever it is that shames you will be something important to you, an essential part of yourself. And if you're interested in and care about the interest of others, you will spend much of your life blushing. Conversely, if you don't care, then attempts to shame you won't move you. Shame highlights different levels of interest. Shame goes to the heart of who we think we are, and in this sense, shame puts one's self-esteem on the line and questions our value systems. Shame is different from guilt. Shame is much more severe. Guilt is more action-based than shame. We can distinguish the two as being guilt as I did something wrong, while shame is there's something wrong with me. While shame theorist Gershon Kaufman agrees that shame is generated by the incomplete reduction of interest or enjoyment, he also believes it is activated by breaking the interpersonal bridge. The interpersonal bridge, it forms between a child and their parent. Through interpersonal scenes which establish emotional ties and vital bonds that span the gulf between a strange infant and mother and later father, drawing them securely together. An interpersonal bridge forms out of reciprocal interest and shared experiences of trust. When this bridge breaks, it activates shame. The interpersonal bridge can be restored if when one has behaved insensitively or reacted badly and has thereby activated shame in someone loved or valued, all that is required in reapproaching the other is to openly, honestly acknowledge one's own part in the shaming process. This will release the other's shame. However, if this bridge is not restored between the parent and child, it can lead to an internalized shame script, as we will see when looking at the work of Edna O'Brien. Bowson relays that shame sufferers feel in some way profoundly inferior to others. They perceive themselves as deeply flawed and defective, as bad individuals, or as failures. And this internalized shame script grows out of repeated interactions with shaming parents or contemptuous others. Some people are more shame-prone than others. Leighton argues for the distinction between the aristocrat shame and the underdog shame. What might only slightly embarrass a privileged person might evoke shame in the socially subordinate. This happens because those who have not been shamed by their gender, class, or race have the privilege to either internalize or defy the prompt to shame. As we will see, O'Brien's protagonist, Kathleen, because of her gender and position in society, will not have this privilege to defy the prompt to shame. We will see how effective scripts are the ways and patterns of how life's material will be composed. Our early experiences, framed by class, race, and gender, are reproduced in how we understand possibility and mitigation of shame. As shame is not only an individual embodied experience, but one rooted in familial and cultural contexts, the shame effect may be hardwired into the human physiology, but it arises in both intrapsychic and interpersonal contexts, and those in turn differ from family to family and culture to culture. O'Brien's first three novels, The Country Girls, The Lonely Girl, and Girls and Their Merry Bliss, placed in a trilogy with an epilogue more than 20 years after their original conception, are powerful enough to stand alone but benefit from being read together. Originally written between 1960 and 1964, following the efforts of the state and church to limit women to the domestic sphere, culminating in the 1937 Constitution, which, according to England, underlined in Article 41.2 women's domestic identity as bearers of children and keepers of the home. In this role, women were expected to ensure the stability of the state and preservation of the family and upholding of Catholic values. After the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922, there was also the imposition of marriage bars, restriction on women's employment in the civil service in 1925, restrictions in industrial employment in 1935, the Jury's Bill of 1927, which exempted women from jury service, and the Criminal Law Amendment Bill of 1934, which banned the sale of or importation of contraceptives. In 1961, 94.9% of Ireland identified as Roman Catholic. And not only that, White tells us that Ireland in this time was not unusual because of the large majority being Catholic, but because the large majority were practicing and committed Catholics. The recently published report of the Mother and Baby Home Commission of Investigation wrote, quote, "The Catholic Church did not invent Irish attitudes to prudent marriages or family respectability. However, it reinforced them through the church teachings that emphasized the importance of premarital purity and the sexual dangers associated with dance halls, immodest dress, mixed bathing, and other sources of temptation. In the 1920s, the Irish Free State was a newly independent nation, which was determined to show the world that it was different. Part of that difference related to the capacity to withstand the undesirable aspects of modernity, including sexual license and alien cultures. There was a strong alignment of views between church and state, resulting in legislation against contraception, divorce, censorship of cinema and publication that was bolstered by church sermons denouncing sexual immorality and the evils of modern society. In the 1960s, with increased access to birth control, divorce, and greater independence, women would begin to undermine these traditional gender relations. Mooney argues that as one of the first generations of Irish women raised under the auspices of the 1937 Constitution, a document which significantly limited the civic responsibilities of Irish women to the domestic sphere, O'Brien concerns herself with the processes and consequences of such socio-religious indoctrination. The Country Girls is the first of a trilogy that will give voice to much of the greater independence women were feeling as the 1960s went on, but also the shame felt by them as they undermined traditional gender relations in Ireland. Consequently, O'Brien's books were censored as obscene, labeled a smear on womanhood, and she was publicly denounced by Archbishop John Charles McQuaid while the local priest held a book burning of her novel. O'Leary claims we find it harmless 60 years on, but when it was first published, the protagonist's sexuality and irreverence was considered a risk to public morality. O'Brien was immediately accused of bringing shame on Irish women. In the foreword to the trilogy published in 2017, McBride wrote, quote, "O'Brien was not only giving voice to the voiceless, but washing the nation's dirty laundry in public. Laundry that was indeed proved so dirty that more than 50 years after the Country Girls' momentous publication, it still is in need of needing a rinse." End quote. For many years, not much academic work has been done on her writing. Because whether it was because too controversial or because her work was seen to be fully accepted within the domains of high literature and academia, and the insistent by some critics of her early novels as being female romance or pure autobiography. and others as pornography disguised as literature, fiction without a story, or fiction with only one story repeated again and again. However, we can see that O'Brien gives voice to the female shame of a generation that needed to be heard, rather than bringing shame upon them. As Marilyn Mason reminds us that shame is systemic, and that she calls for more attention to be paid to the overpowering and typically overlooked cultural context of shame, it is on this note that we will begin to look at the Country Girls trilogy. O'Brien states that she decided to have two protagonists for the trilogy. Quote, one Kathleen, who would conform to both my own and my country's view of what an Irish woman should be, and one Baba, who would undermine every piece of protocol on religion and hypocrisy that there was, end quote. I assert that in this way, Kathleen represents shame and Baba shamelessness. Not only that, we follow Kathleen, the supposed ideal of Irish Catholic girlhood, as she develops in this trilogy into a woman who suffers from chronic internalized shame, which leads to her distressing life and unfortunate death. In the first novel, a Bildungsroman set in mid-century Western rural Ireland, we follow Kathleen through a childhood shaped by shame, which inevitably leads to a life of internalized shame. In a patriarchal society, driven by the concept of the nuclear family and women as bearers of national identity and virtue, Kathleen is subject to repeated beatings by her drunken father and eventual death of her dear loving martyr of a mother. The repeated scenes that Kathleen experiences which involve shame will rule the rest of her life, as they will form a script which will dictate how she responds to situations in the future, caused by body issues, peers, intimate relationships, especially with foreign older married men, and nuns during her time at the convent. Prior to her death, there is a mutual admiration between Kathleen and her mother, who is depicted as a martyr, yet the first words of the book are not about her mother, but her father. Quote, I awakened quickly and sat up in bed abruptly. It is only when I'm anxious that I awaken easily, and for a minute I did not know my heart was beating faster than usual. Then I remembered the old reason he had not come home, end quote. Depicting the deep-seated fear he instills in his daughter and wife, we are introduced to Kathleen's father as a drunk and violent man. Her relationship with this man will form much of her life, as the interpersonal bridge between the two never recovers. As stated, shame cannot be felt, or can not only be felt when an individual feels a partial diminishing of the affect's joy or interest, but also when the interpersonal bridge is broken, which will be illustrated through Kathleen's relationships with both of her parents. It is important that we examine the familial relationships in the Country Girls, as shame is both an individual and familial experience, which is reproduced within families, and each culture has its own distinct sources as well as targets of shame. Shame arises from the trauma of defective or abusive parenting or relationships, and from various forms of sexual, racial, or social denigration of females, which we will see in Kathleen's relationship with her father and the culture she is raised in. Fear shapes much of her life as we know it within the first few pages. Fear of her father and fear of hell. When speaking of the Virgin Mary, who stares at her icily from a gilt frame, Kathleen tells us that the Virgin once spoke to her when she had, quote, got out of bed in the middle of the night to say an aspiration. I got out of bed 6 or 7 times every night as an act of penance. I was afraid of hell, end quote. The only thing that Kathleen fears more than her father is hell, or the death of her mother. By the third chapter, we learn simultaneously with our first-person narrator, Kathleen, that her mother has left her father, taking her rosary but leaving her, and she is to stay with her wealthier, cruel tormentor and friend, Baba. Baba is one of the key elements of Kathleen's life, and is a source of shame for Kathleen, typically intentionally, as she intends to humiliate her on numerous occasions. Her mother never returns as she drowns, which is another breaking of the interpersonal bridge, and leaves Kathleen with only her father and Baba for solace, and as a consequence, she will turn to an older married man, Mr. Gentleman. After many shaming experiences involving Baba, the nuns at the convent, and her own father, Baba convinces Kathleen to become purposefully expelled from the convent in a shame-filled episode involving a dirty note left on a holy card of the Virgin Mary. The two shamefully arrive home before going to Dublin together. When her father learns of her expulsion, he slaps her in the audience of Baba's family, which is crucial because shame is an affect that is sensitive to being seen, and we see how Kathleen is used as a target for her father as a possible conduit of shame for the family. The scene will repeat itself at least 2 more times in the trilogy as her father continues to interfere with her life because he sees her as the source of family shame. Charlotte Bunch and Roxanne Carrillo postulate that women were socialized to associate their self-worth with the satisfaction of the needs and desires of others, and are thus encouraged to blame themselves as inadequate or bad if men beat them. While Kaufman explores the many shaming messages parents routinely impart on their children and their efforts to control the child or to break his or her will. Such messages may be unintentional, appear benign, but their chronic usage will result in a shame-prone personality. Towards the end of the novel, Kathleen has begun a romantic relationship with Mr. Gentleman, an older married foreigner from her town who visits her in Dublin. She knows that she is doing is wrong, and she hears her mother's voice shaming her for the relationship and her behavior with Baba. The final scene of the novel is Mr. Gentleman relaying to Kathleen by telegram that he would not be joining her on the continent, where they plan to consummate the relationship, because of threats from her father and his wife having a breakdown. Kathleen is left humiliated, waiting in the rain for her to take her away. She is once again abandoned, only furthering her shame and breaking of yet another interpersonal bridge between someone she loves. The scene will repeat again in the second novel when her father and countrymen interfere in her love life to protect her family from shame and another older married foreigner. Affect, imagery, and language are directly engaged in creating a shaming scene, and in this scene that subsequently becomes stored in memory inside of the self, and it is within these scenes that produce the fabric of the self. Kathleen is developing shaming scenes from repeated moments like this that have become stored inside of her and will determine how she reacts to future situations. Scenes make up an individual's script, and shame sufferers feel in some way profoundly inferior to others. They perceive themselves as deeply flawed and defective, or as bad individuals and failures. And this internalized shame script grows out of repeated interactions with shaming parents or contemptuous others. The second novel, The Lonely Girl, is set in Dublin and primarily focuses on Baba and Kathleen's adaptation to life in the large city and romantic attachments they partake in. Kathleen struggles with her morality even without the physical interference from her father, as she continues to hear her dead mother's voice condemning her for the vices she has developed while living in Dublin, where she has stopped going to Mass. Baba continues to be her friend, roommate, and enemy, whose brazen shamelessness in regard to drinking and men seemed to only add to the shame experienced by the already shame-prone Kathleen, who is now not only experiencing her own shame about her lifestyle in the city, but secondhand shame from Baba's shamelessness. Kathleen increasingly struggles with her morality as the novel progresses, as does her relationship with her second married foreign lover, Eugene. She begins to be known as Kate rather than Kathleen because it was too Kiltartan for Eugene's liking. This is the beginning of the contempt and resentment Eugene has for Kathleen, which will develop into the next novel and culminates in his eventually taking away their child. We can see that the relationships Kathleen forms are not healthy and are based on a desire to fulfill what her father cannot, a healthy interpersonal bond. Kathleen belongs to a socialization process that continues through adolescence, where women learn to define their self-identity through a relationship to a man, not surprisingly in mid-century Ireland. Kathleen feels unlovable and inferior because of her internalized shame, and this pattern repeats in her search for love. Though eventually Kathleen and Eugene become intimate, she has a fit of shivering when it comes too close and goes to sleep mortified, as she has never felt so ashamed of her whole life because of how she treated him when he attempted to become intimate with her. An anonymous source eventually alerts her father of his daughter's indiscretion of taking up with a married man who, quote, has no religion. He shipped his wife to America, and the house is a blind to get young women in there and dope them. Your daughter goes there alone. I hope I am not too late in warning you, as I would not like to see a nice Catholic girl ruined by a dirty foreigner, end quote. Her father shows up to the shop she is working at and makes her return to the country, where she meets with the local priest who tells her she is walking the path to moral damnation. And when she says her father is worse than Eugene as a man, she is told to not speak of her father badly, as every man drinks, and it is just the climate. She runs away, and her father and countrymen arrive at Eugene's house and attack him while Kathleen hides, hiding not only from fear, but also from her shame. After they leave, Eugene buys her a ring to stop the villagers from shaming her, though he is still not divorced his wife. The relationship does not last, and when she leaves him, thinking he will follow her, shouting to Baba, "He does want me, he does want me." He does not, and she experiences abandonment once again, only reinforcing the shame script. Her interest in Eugene has not subsided, but has been partially diminished by the rejection, resulting in further shame. By the end of the second novel, she is again alone and moves with Baba, who for a moment she believed was pregnant, to London. The third novel, ironically named Girls in Their Married Bliss, is told to us from Baba's perspective rather than Kathleen's first-person narration, as if Kathleen's perspective is too shameful to recount, and she hides from the affect that revolves around fear of being seen as inferior and lesser than by the other. Baba is now our primary source of information, as she was always the one who did not care about the church and society, and so continues the story for us. Kathleen's life does not improve in the third novel. Once in London, Kathleen eventually reunites with Eugene and finds herself pregnant outside of wedlock. Despite divorcing his wife and marrying her, Kathleen repeats this pattern of searching for love in inappropriate places. Though she never physically cheats on Eugene, he takes her child and divorces her in a very calculated and cruel way. Separated from her only child, another breaking of an interpersonal bridge, she decides to sterilize herself, permanently separating herself from the Irish female ideal of motherhood, as she feels she is no longer worthy of being a mother. At this point, Eugene clearly illustrates his contempt for Kathleen, and as Wormser states, contempt by others is a type of aggression that degrades the individual's value by equating her with a debased, dirty thing, derided and low animal. Not only is she being shamed by her husband, but she also feels shame at the thought of her failing relationship with her husband. And although the masculine characters are negatively portrayed in much of O'Brien's work, it is usually the women who are punished. Brooks Hughes writes that abuse and misogyny are internalized in O'Brien's women and converted into self-hatred, specifically hatred of the gendered body. And shame has been internalized as well in Kathleen's case, which has led to her sterilization. Kathleen is attempting to take away her shame of being a failed wife and mother, and her self-contempt. In severe shaming situations, one no longer wishes to explore and take interest in the world, as they feel defected, making them feel not only unlovable, but that one is undeserving of love and unworthy of a place in society. Kathleen's response to shame is to completely degrade herself and feel inferior, and we can identify that she has now developed an internalized shame script that is growing because of repeated scenes of shame. When the severity of shame in a person leads to self-contempt, the resulting feeling can be that they would like to get rid of or remove part of themselves they hate, represented by her sterilization, which in turn can lead them to become suicidal. O'Brien wrote the epilogue in 1986 because she had left them suspended, thinking, quote, they could stay young indefinitely, or their mistakes might be canceled, but that they would achieve the Taddeus fallacy of rebirth. End quote. She knew that she needed to write the epilogue because Baba's asperity had to prevail. Yet Kathleen does not survive. The epilogue, which Brian states is writing beyond the ending, and in this case we have writing beyond the grave, frames the stories of Kate and Baba in metaphors of religion and romantic love. The function of these metaphors, Brian suggests, is not to reinforce prescribed roles for women, but rather draw attention to them. The conventional endings for female characters are marriage or death. Baba again is our narrator and tells us of Kate's death, and after 20 years that have passed, and of the 20 years that have passed since the last novel. Baba continues in her unhappy marriage to a wealthy yet dim and insecure Irish man, with the child she conceived out of wedlock, which he raised rather than admit he was a cuckold. He is now at a stroke, and she is his caretaker. Baba is sitting in Waterloo Station waiting for Kate's casket, the same station that Kathleen slashed her wrists in 20 years before, though this time she has not survived. Eventually, we learn that Kathleen died by accidental drowning at a health facility she had gone to. Her son had left her again after she had won back custody in a court trial and gone to university in America. The last time Baba saw Kathleen, she was in love with a married man once again who told her that he could not leave his family for her. And she told Baba, quote, if I get through this, I'm all right, Kathleen said. Through what? Baba said. This last big breach, Kathleen said, and Baba went all cold because she sensed something calamitous. Kathleen had put her hand to her heart, and she said she'd like to tear it out, stamp on it, squash it to death, her heart being her undoing. Her heart was not her undoing, but her shame was. After repeated ruptures of relationships, constant shaming at the hands of her friends, kin, countrymen, and husband, she could no longer handle life. As Baba says, quote, I don't blame her. I realized she was in the effing wilderness. Born there, hadn't the reins to haul herself out, end quote. Brian claims in spite of Baba's less than happy marriage, she survives, in part because she was the heroine who understands every piece of protocol and religion and hypocrisy that there was. Baba is critical of the church to the end, discussing its stance on motherhood and contraception as she relays her only friend's tragic ending. Baba's shamelessness was her savior, while Kathleen's shame was her undoing. Andrew P. Morrison notes that one term for shame, mortification, gestures toward the lethal quality. In the word's invocation of death, to feel mortified is to feel self-destructive to the point of being suicidal. When a person comes to the point where there is no place left to hide from the shame and contempt they feel, it becomes lethal and they choose to erase themselves. Nunes writes that not unlike sterilization that prefigures it, suicide, as she reasons, is the only means by which she can simultaneously satisfy all elements of the contradictory demands upon her. When she succeeds later in achieving her own death by drowning, she essentially meets her own punishment, performing the ultimate act of submission and the ultimate act of penitence for that submission. When shame is no longer used as a chance to reevaluate the self and do good, but instead as an internalized chronic condition, which after repeated scenes of shame for their entire life, it will lead to self-contempt and suicide. Edna O'Brien's narrative gives testimony to the female shame pervading the culture of Ireland in the 20th century. There is shame about shame, and it can be a painful thing to write about, but it is through the narration, articulation, and recognition of shame that we can process it, be freed from it, and some argue heal it. By confronting issues such as marriage, sexuality, family, education, religion, and motherhood in the trilogy, O'Brien offered us a shame narrative. Just as Weston argues that trauma narratives attest to the frequency of trauma, and it's important as a multi-contextual social issue, as it is a consequence of political ideologies, colonization, war, domestic violence, and poverty. Similarly, in the Country Girls trilogy, trauma is not purely the matter of the psychological damage of one individual. Kathleen's traumas are Ireland's traumas. I argue that Kathleen's shame is Ireland's shame. We have seen how, with the creation of O'Brien, gave a voice to the experiences of a previously muzzled generation of Irish women, and to bodies raised to the expectation of violence, rape, forced pregnancy, innumerable dangerous childbirths, domestic bondage, and the ever-present risk of institutionalization for intentionally or unintentionally bringing shame on male relations. She breached the radical oxygen or choice, desire, and sensual delight. Crucially, Probin tells us that ideas in writing about shame seek to regenerate new ways of thinking about how we are related to history, and we wish to live in the present. And hopefully, in this way, the fictional death of Kathleen will help us reflect on how we wish to live in the present in relationship to our culture and faith. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am now going to turn off the recording and we can begin to discuss Carleigh's excellent presentation.